Daniel always said, "Promise me you'll never go to that ranch alone, Maggie." I'm standing at rusted gates in the New Mexico desert, holding keys the lawyer gave me after the funeral. It's dangerous out there. Just promise me. I promised. But Daniel's gone now, and his brothers want this land so badly they're calling me incompetent in court. I plan to sign it all away. Let them have their precious ranch. But when I turn that key and the gate swings open, when I see what Daniel was really hiding in that desert, my hands start shaking. Because this isn't just a ranch. This is why they want me gone. They had no idea what I was about to discover. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments where in the world are you listening from. Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The kitchen table bears the weight of Margaret Hayes's morning ritual like an altar to widowhood. Steam curls upward from her coffee mug, a ceramic piece chipped along the handle where Daniel once dropped it during a hurried breakfast 3 years ago. She runs her thumb over that familiar rough edge now, feeling the small imperfection that somehow makes the mug more precious than perfect china ever could. Dust motes dance through the thin November sunlight that slants through her kitchen window. Each tiny particle caught in golden suspension above the organized chaos of her life. Bills pile here in neat stacks, Medicare papers there in manila. Folders labeled with her careful teacher's handwriting, grocery coupons sorted by expiration date in a small wicker basket that once held their wedding gifts. At 62, Margaret has learned to break her widow's existence into manageable pieces. Monday is grocery day. Tuesday, laundry and doctor appointments. Wednesday, the bills that arrive like persistent reminders that life continues even when the person who shared it has gone. This routine has carried her through 6 weeks of mornings without Daniel's coffee. Brewing sounds, 6 weeks of dinners eaten alone while evening news anchors fill the silence he left behind. Her fingers pause over an envelope bearing Daniel's name in familiar block letters from the Medicare office. The paper crinkles as she unfolds it, releasing that particular scent of bureaucracy, ink and processing chemicals, and the faint mustiness of government offices where forms multiply like living things. Even in death, Daniel's mail continues arriving as though the Postal Service refuses to acknowledge his absence. The Medicare explanation of benefits spreads across the table like a map to confusion. Most of the entries make sense: his cardiologist visits, the prescription refills, the routine tests that marked his final months like mileposts on a journey toward goodbye. She has grown accustomed to these medical hieroglyphs, learning to decode co-pays and deductibles with the same methodical patience she once applied to teaching Shakespeare to reluctant teenagers. But one line stops her completely. Outpatient cardiac consultation, Santa Rosa, New Mexico. Date of service August 15th. Amount $3,480. The numbers swim before her eyes. She blinks, adjusts her reading glasses' plastic frames scratched from years of late-night grading, and reads the line again. Santa Rosa sits 3 hours north of Albuquerque, a small town she's visited perhaps twice in 41 years of marriage. Daniel never mentioned driving there, never mentioned seeing specialists anywhere beyond their familiar medical complex on the west side of the city. The heater kicks on in the hallway, coughing like an old man clearing his throat. The sound echoes through the small house, bouncing off walls that still hold the scent of Daniel's aftershave. And the faint aroma of the cigarettes he thought she didn't know about. Outside, Mrs. Rodriguez's dog barks once at a passing delivery truck, then subsides into the peaceful morning quiet of their neighborhood. "Danny," she whispers to the empty kitchen, "what were you doing up there?" The question hangs in the air above her half-empty pill organizer, 7 plastic compartments labeled with the days of the week, each containing the small arsenal of medications that keep her arthritis manageable and her blood pressure stable. Beside it sits yesterday's newspaper, still folded to the crossword puzzle she abandoned when the clue for 7 down proved too difficult without Daniel's encyclopedic knowledge of obscure historical figures. Her Social Security check envelope rests nearby, already opened, already calculated against this month's expenses in the running tally she maintains in her checkbook register. Everything fits into neat columns of income and outgo, a mathematical poem of survival. That she's refined over decades of stretching teacher salaries and pension checks to cover mortgages and car repairs and the thousand small emergencies that define middle-class life. Everything except this one mysterious line from Santa Rosa. When the telephone rings, the sound cuts through her contemplation like a blade through silk. She jumps, nearly spilling coffee across the Medicare form, her heart hammering with the particular anxiety that unexpected calls bring to widows. The caller ID displays a name she doesn't recognize: Coleman and Ruiz, attorneys at law. Her finger hovers over the answer button. In her experience, lawyers don't call widows with good news. They call about unpaid bills, forgotten debts, the legal debris that accumulates around death like silt around a stone. Mrs. Hayes? This is Roberto Ruiz. I represented your late husband's estate. The voice carries careful professionalism wrapped around what might be genuine sympathy. She straightens in her chair, gripping the phone with fingers that have grown stiff from arthritis and the cold that seems to live permanently in her bones now. There's a matter concerning your inheritance that we need to discuss. An additional property your husband owned that wasn't included in the basic probate filing. The words flowed between them like smoke. Additional property. She looks around her modest kitchen with its chipped linoleum and cabinets that Daniel painted himself 15 years ago. The careful brushstrokes still visible if you know where to look. Property? The word emerges smaller than she intended. Mr. Ruiz, we could barely keep up with this mortgage. Daniel drove a 12-year-old truck and bought his shirts at discount stores. A pause stretches across the phone line, filled with the soft rustling of papers and what might be the lawyer clearing his throat. Ma'am, this is significant. I'd strongly prefer to explain the details in person, if you could come to our office this week. After she hangs up, Maggie stares at the Medicare form until the numbers blur together. The kitchen feels smaller than it did an hour ago. The walls pressing closer while her coffee grows cold and the morning light shifts to illuminate different corners of her carefully ordered life. The heater cycles off, leaving behind a silence that seems to hold its breath. She drives downtown 2 days later, her hands steady on the wheel of her aging Honda Civic but her mind spinning through possibilities she can't quite name. The law office occupies a narrow space between a pawn shop advertising quick loans and a tax preparation service promising maximum refunds. The kind of strip mall professional building that serves real people with real problems rather than corporate clients with abstract wealth. Inside, dark wood shelves line the walls, heavy with law books that show actual wear rather than decorator spines. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, offers coffee that tastes like it was made this morning rather than yesterday. And the waiting area chairs don't force her to sit awkwardly due to her arthritis. Attorney Ruiz appears younger than his telephone voice suggested, with gray threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that suggest he spends significant time squinting at legal documents. He guides her into a conference room where afternoon sunlight streams through windows that face the street, casting rectangular patches of light across a polished table that reflects the papers he spreads before her. The first document is a property deed, heavy paper with raised seals and the kind of legal language that seems designed to obscure rather than illuminate. But one phrase emerges clearly: 5,000 acres, Mora County, New Mexico. The second item makes her breath catch. An old brass key attached to a leather tag, the metal worn smooth by handling, its surface reflecting the office lights like a small sun. Something about its weight suggests it opens more than just a simple lock. Your husband purchased this ranch 3 years ago, Ruiz says carefully. The land sits over mineral deposits, oil, natural gas, and potentially significant uranium reserves. Several energy companies have already contacted our office about purchasing options. Uranium. The word settles into the room like lead, heavy and dangerous and completely foreign to anything in Maggie's experience. She thinks of her Medicare card, her Social Security statements, her teacher's pension that arrives each month like clockwork, numbers that make sense, figures that fit into her understanding of their shared life. I don't understand, she says finally, though what she really means is I don't want to understand. Understanding implies responsibility, choice, a future more complicated than simply managing her grief. And her small fixed income until one or the other runs out. Ruiz slides a third envelope across the table, this one sealed with tape that has yellowed around the edges. Daniel's handwriting spells out her name in the careful block letters he used for important documents, the same writing that appears on their tax returns. Their insurance policies, the birthday cards he never forgot to buy despite his masculine protests that he wasn't sentimental. Inside, his confession unfolds in paragraphs she reads twice before the meaning penetrates. Land that his father once owned and nearly lost to creditors. Brothers who had tried to manipulate their aging parents out of inheritance rights. A secret purchase made to protect something she never knew needed protection. I wanted to leave you something no one could touch, Maggie, the letter reads in his voice, as clear as if he were sitting beside her. Something that would give you choices I never had the courage to fight for while I was alive. But I couldn't face the war with my family that this would bring, so I left that fight for you. I'm sorry for the cowardice, but not for the love behind it. Her hands tremble as she reads the final paragraph. If you're reading this, it means they've come calling. Don't let them bully you into anything quick. You're stronger and smarter than they'll ever be, even if you don't feel that way right now. The key opens more than just a gate, it opens your freedom, if you're brave enough to claim it. The paper crinkles as she folds it with care, her vision blurred by tears that taste of salt and surprise and a grief so fresh it feels like reopened wounds. Through the office window, traffic moves in normal patterns along the street, people going about their ordinary Tuesday afternoon business, unaware that her understanding of her marriage, her security, her future has just shifted like tectonic plates beneath her feet. So he left me the war he couldn't fight, she whispers. On her drive home, the setting sun paints the western mountains in shades of copper and rose. She stops at a gas station off Interstate 25, where diesel fumes mix with the scent of fried food from the attached convenience store. And the clean bite of desert air that carries promises of snow in the higher elevations. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the pump canopy, she spreads the ranch deed across her dashboard next to the Medicare form and the brass key. The documents seem to exist in different universes. Medicare represents the known world of co-pays and deductibles, Social Security checks and careful budgeting. The ranch deed speaks of mineral rights and energy companies, of wealth beyond her comprehension and complications beyond her experience. The key sits between them, heavy with possibility and threat. A secret ranch worth millions of dollars. Medical appointments she knew nothing about. Brothers that Daniel never talked about in 41 years of marriage. She lifts the key, feeling its weight against her palm. The metal has warmed from her touch, and something about its solidity suggests it has been waiting for her. Specifically, holding its purpose through years of Daniel's planning and months of her ignorance. If this is protection, she says to her reflection in the windshield. Where the gas station lights create a double image of herself, one clear, one ghostly, both uncertain, why does it feel like I'm about to walk into a trap? The drive back to Albuquerque takes her through landscape that looks different now, charged with possibility she's not sure she wants. Every mesa formation might hold uranium deposits. Every patch of seemingly worthless desert might conceal resources worth fighting over. The familiar becomes foreign when viewed through the lens of secrets and hidden wealth. Back home, she stands in her small living room, holding the ranch key in one hand and her Medicare card in the other, as though weighing two different versions of her future. The television murmurs its evening litany of news: rising energy prices, drought conditions across the Southwest, political battles over mineral rights on federal land, but she barely processes the words. All her life, the desert has represented freedom to her. Open sky stretching toward infinity, space to breathe, horizons that promise escape from whatever constraints might be pressing close. Tonight, staring at the key that represents 5,000 acres of possibilities she never imagined. The desert feels like a locked door she's suddenly expected to open. But as she turns the key over in her palm, feeling its smoothed edges and solid weight, something shifts in her understanding. Daniel didn't leave her a burden. He left her a choice. The key can open that door, or she can hand it to someone else to open for her. She can step through into uncertainty, or she can remain in the safety of Medicare forms and pension checks. And a small life carefully managed around predictable limitations. The heater cycles on again, filling the house with the familiar sound of forced air moving through ductwork that needs cleaning. Somewhere down the street, Mrs. Rodriguez's dog barks at something invisible. Her coffee mug sits empty on the kitchen table, tomorrow's mail already beginning to accumulate in the basket by the door. But in her hand, the key grows warm against her skin. And for the first time since Daniel's funeral, Margaret Hayes finds herself planning not just how to survive the next day, but how to discover what kind of woman she might become if she's brave enough to find out. The rental SUV shudders over cracked asphalt as Maggie drives north through landscape that transforms with each passing mile, her knuckles bone white against the steering wheel. Where her wedding ring catches the late morning sun, the familiar rolling hills of central New Mexico give way to high desert country, punctuated by mesa formations that rise from the earth like ancient monuments to geological patience. Through her open window, the air grows thinner and drier, carrying scents of sage and juniper that speak of places where water is precious and survival requires adaptation. Chala cactus and scrub oak flash past in her peripheral vision, each plant precisely spaced by nature's mathematics of competition and cooperation. The landscape looks desolate to untrained eyes, but Maggie recognizes the desert's hidden abundance, the way morning dew collects on waxy leaves, how small animals create networks of trails invisible from the road. The manner in which seemingly barren ground supports complex ecosystems that thrive in conditions that would kill more fragile life. She glances at the brass key resting on the passenger seat for what must be the 20th time since leaving Albuquerque. It sits there like an accusation, catching light from the windshield and throwing small reflections onto the dashboard with each bump in the road. The key has acquired a weight beyond its physical mass, becoming a talisman of choices she's not ready to make and responsibilities she never asked to inherit. If this turns out to be some kind of elaborate mistake, she tells the empty car, her voice thin in the rushing air from the partially opened windows, I'll sign whatever papers they want me to sign and drive straight back home before sunset. But even as she speaks the words, her chest tightens with recognition of their falseness. Something deep in her bones knows that simple solutions disappeared the moment she opened Daniel's letter, that whatever waits at the end of this drive will change her life in ways she can't yet imagine. The entrance to Coyote Mesa Ranch materializes around a sweeping curve in the two-lane highway like a mirage resolving into reality. Two massive steel gates interrupt a fence line that stretches toward both horizons, the metal posts disappearing into heat shimmer and distance. The gates themselves look substantial enough to stop a freight train, their surfaces painted in desert camouflage that blends with the surrounding landscape until approaching drivers might miss them entirely. The ranch name is cut into weathered metal with industrial precision, each letter large enough to read from a quarter-mile away, Coyote Mesa Ranch, beneath a stylized silhouette of a mesa formation. The letters have been filled with rust-red paint that has faded under decades of desert sun but maintains its bold declaration of ownership and purpose. Maggie parks her SUV in the gravel pull-off beside the gates, dust settling around her vehicle like stage smoke. The silence that greets her when she turns off the engine feels profound, weighted with the kind of quiet that exists only in places where human activity remains peripheral to larger natural forces. No traffic sounds penetrate here, no air conditioning units or leaf blowers or suburban lawnmowers. Only wind moving through desert vegetation and the distant call of a hawk riding thermals above the mesa. She approaches the padlock with the key clutched in her palm. Its metal warm from her body heat and slick with perspiration that has nothing to do with the desert temperature. The lock looks industrial strength, the kind of security that protects valuable property rather than empty land. When she slides the key into the mechanism, it turns with silky smoothness that surprises her. No rust, no resistance, no grinding of long unused parts. Someone has maintained this lock with the care reserved for frequently used equipment. The padlock clicks open with a sound that echoes across the empty landscape like a gunshot. The weight falls into her palm, heavy and warm, while the gates swing inward on hinges that whisper rather than squeal. Beyond them, a well-maintained gravel road curves between low hills covered with piñón pine and juniper. The surface recently graded and edged with precision that speaks of professional maintenance rather than casual upkeep. This isn't abandoned land. This isn't some worthless patch of desert that Daniel bought on an impulse during a moment of pharmaceutical confusion. Someone has been investing serious money in this place, maintaining it with care that extends beyond simple ownership into active stewardship. As she drives toward the cluster of buildings visible in the distance, Maggie passes infrastructure that makes her breath catch in her throat. Two pump jacks operate with hypnotic rhythm against the enormous sky. Their dinosaur-like heads dipping and rising in mechanical meditation that speaks of oil being drawn from deep beneath the desert floor. The sight stops her progress completely, forcing her to pull over and stare at these monuments to industrial extraction that Daniel never mentioned. Never hinted at, never acknowledged in 41 years of shared finances and future planning. Orange surveyor flags mark a precise line of capped test wells along the eastern ridge. Each flag snapping in the constant wind like small declarations of territorial conquest. The chemical smell of petroleum processing mingles with the clean scents of desert sage and morning air, creating an olfactory map of human intervention in natural processes. Her hands shake as she grips the steering wheel, trying to process the implications of operating oil wells on land that supposedly belongs to her. The main house sprawls across a gentle rise like an organic extension of the landscape itself. Built in southwestern adobe style that honors regional architectural traditions while incorporating modern amenities that speak of substantial investment. Solar panels cover the roof in geometric precision, their dark surfaces already collecting morning light and converting it to electricity with efficiency that Daniel, always conscious of utility bills, would have admired. A wraparound porch promises cool shade during the brutal desert summers. Its posts and railings crafted from materials that will age gracefully under relentless sun and occasional storms. Maggie sits in her vehicle for several minutes, engine ticking as it cools, trying to reconcile this substantial property with the modest life she and Daniel shared in Albuquerque. They shopped for clothes at discount stores. They drove vehicles until repair costs exceeded their value. They celebrated their wedding anniversary with dinner at chain restaurants, and considered themselves fortunate when unexpected expenses didn't force them to dip into savings. "We could barely afford new tires for the Honda," she whispers to her reflection in the rearview mirror, where her own eyes stare back with confusion and something approaching fear. Inside the house, cool air embraces her like a benediction, carrying scents of cedar and leather and something else she can't immediately identify, the subtle aroma of new construction, carefully aged to suggest established comfort rather than raw development. The hallway leads through rooms that flow into one another with architectural grace, each space furnished with pieces that balance durability with aesthetic appeal, everything coordinated without feeling contrived or showy. The kitchen astounds her with granite countertops that reflect morning light streaming through strategically placed windows. Stainless steel appliances that still bear discreet price tags tucked behind handles, and cabinet hardware that gleams with the particular luster of genuine quality rather than superficial shine. Every detail suggests careful planning and generous budget, from the tile work that extends seamlessly from floor to backsplash to the lighting fixtures that provide both task illumination and ambient warmth. In what must be Daniel's office, she discovers a workspace that reflects his methodical nature magnified by resources she never knew he possessed. A massive oak desk dominates the room, its surface large enough to accommodate multiple projects while maintaining organization. Two large computer monitors sit precisely aligned, connected to equipment that represents technology far beyond anything they owned in Albuquerque. A locked filing cabinet stands against one wall like a metal sentinel guarding secrets she's only beginning to suspect. The laptop computer rests closed on the desk with a yellow sticky note attached to its cover, Daniel's careful handwriting, instantly recognizable despite the tremor in her hands, for M.H. Password our first dog's name your birth year. Her heart performs an irregular rhythm as she types Buster 1961. The screen illuminates to reveal a desktop organized with the same precision Daniel applied to everything in his life. Folders align in perfect rows, each labeled with titles that suggest months or years of careful documentation. Geology, Brothers, Legal Strategy, Environmental Impact, for Maggie. Each folder icon sits precisely spaced, waiting for her to discover whatever truths Daniel couldn't bring himself to share while he remained alive to face the consequences. Before she can click on any of the folders, the crunch of tires on gravel draws her attention to the window with sharp urgency. A black SUV approaches through the heat shimmer like a predator materializing from camouflage dust. billowing behind its oversized tires in a cloud that speaks of speed and purpose. The vehicle pulls alongside her rental with mechanical precision, its dark windows reflecting the desert landscape while concealing whoever sits inside. 3 men emerge with movements that suggest familiarity with this place. Stepping onto the gravel with boots that raise small puffs of dust and confidence that requires no announcement. They carry Daniel's basic facial architecture, the same broad jaw, the same pattern of gray threading through dark hair. The same height and general build that marked the Hayes men since their grandfather's generation. But their eyes hold calculation rather than Daniel's gentleness, assessment rather than his instinctive warmth toward others. The oldest raises his hands to cup around his mouth, his voice carrying easily across the distance between house and driveway with the practiced projection of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Maggie? It's Earl, Daniel's older brother. We need to talk about this situation before you do something that can't be undone." Her finger hovers over the laptop's power button while her heart hammers against her ribs with flight or fight intensity. Through the window, she watches the 3 men stride onto the porch with the entitled confidence of people who have always owned everything they see, their boots. Heavy against wooden planks that echo like drumbeats announcing an invasion. They don't knock with the courtesy reserved for invited guests. Their fists hammer against the door frame with authority that makes the house itself seem to shudder. Each impact loud enough to rattle windows and disturb the careful peace that Daniel constructed in this remote place. "Mrs. Hayes," a second voice bellows through the door, deeper and rougher than Earl's practiced smoothness. "This land has been in our family for 3 generations. You and that city lawyer don't understand the complexities you're dealing with. Let's resolve this before things get ugly for everyone involved." Maggie backs away from the door with instincts she didn't know she possessed, her pulse hammering in her throat while the laptop screen dims to black. Waiting for her to make choices that will determine not just her immediate safety but her entire future. The rational part of her mind whispers familiar advice: open the door. Let them explain, work out whatever misunderstanding has brought them to her doorstep with such urgency and anger. These are Daniel's brothers, after all. Family members who presumably share some obligation toward his widow's welfare. But something in their voices, the tone of command rather than request, the assumption of authority rather than invitation to negotiate, makes every survival instinct she possesses scream warnings that override rational analysis. Their words carry entitlement that extends beyond simple property disputes into something more fundamental. The assumption that she exists at their sufferance rather than by her own right. The pounding intensifies, accompanied by the sound of the door handle being tested with increasing force. Someone rattles the knob hard enough to make the lock mechanism protest with small clicking sounds that suggest either imminent surrender or imminent breakage. "Open this door right now, Maggie." Earl's voice carries new edge that strips away any pretense of family concern. "We're not leaving until we get this mess straightened out, and standing out here in the heat isn't improving anyone's mood." She presses herself against the office wall, clutching the laptop like a shield while her mind races through options that all seem inadequate. Her rental car sits in plain view beside their SUV, making any pretense that she's not here impossible. The house, despite its substantial construction, suddenly feels fragile around her walls. That can be breached, locks that can be broken, safety that depends entirely on the good intentions of men whose voices suggest those intentions may be more complex than simple family solidarity. The knocking stops abruptly, creating silence that feels more threatening than the noise that preceded it. Through the window, she watches them retreat to their vehicle, but they don't leave. They make phone calls while gesturing angrily toward the house, pointing at the oil wells. Their voices carrying on the desert wind without the specific words becoming clear. Their body language speaks of coordination, planning, strategies being adjusted in real time to account for her unexpected resistance. As afternoon shadows begin to lengthen across the gravel drive, Earl's SUV remains positioned like a black obstacle between her and any easy escape route. The brothers continue their telephonic consultations while the desert wind picks up, carrying dust and the distant scent of crude oil and the wild loneliness of places where human comfort remains secondary to larger forces of geology and weather. Maggie sits alone in Daniel's chair, cursor blinking over a folder labeled "Emergency Protocols," with urgency that suggests her situation may not be entirely unprecedented. The screen's blue glow provides the only light in the gradually darkening office while outside. The pump jacks continue their hypnotic rhythm against a sky that transitions from blue to purple to the deep indigo that precedes desert nightfall. Her hands shake as she double-clicks the folder, revealing a single document titled, "If They Come Before You're Ready," and a video file dated just 3 months before Daniel's death. She clicks play with fingers that feel numb from fear and adrenaline. And there he is sitting in this very chair, looking directly into the camera with an expression she never saw during their marriage. Not the gentle confusion of his final illness. Not the resigned acceptance of his declining health, but clear-eyed determination mixed with something that looks remarkably like fear. "If you're watching this, Mags," he says in a voice steady with purpose, "it means they moved faster than I hoped they would. Don't let them intimidate you into signing anything. Everything you need to protect yourself is in these files, but the most important thing is this: you don't owe them explanations. You don't owe them access, and you sure as hell don't owe them this land." The video pauses automatically, leaving her staring at Daniel's frozen image while the sound of truck engines starting carries through the evening air. Red taillights disappear down the ranch road like dying embers, but their departure brings no relief. They know where she is now. They know she's seen the property, touched the key, entered the house that contains evidence of Daniel's secret preparations for a war he knew would come. She opens the geology folder with hands that have steadied into something approaching determination. Revealing maps marked with red circles and technical reports stamped with official seals and photographs of rock cores. That might as well represent treasure maps to someone with proper knowledge to interpret their significance. But even without geological expertise, one thing emerges clearly from the summary documents. This land sits atop mineral resources worth more money than exists in her previous understanding of wealth. The Brothers folder contains financial records that paint a picture of systematic exploitation stretching back decades, bank statements, property transfer documents, and legal papers that reveal Earl and Wayne's patient campaign to separate elderly neighbors from valuable mineral rights, using complexity and confusion as weapons more effective than outright theft. Each transaction follows the same pattern: urgent circumstances, generous immediate payments. Contracts that transfer long-term wealth to the brothers while leaving sellers with modest short-term comfort. Daniel hadn't simply bought a ranch. He had been building a legal fortress designed to protect both the land and his widow from predators who shared his DNA. But none of his scruples about family loyalty extending beyond immediate profit. As full darkness settles over Coyote Mesa, Maggie sits surrounded by evidence of a life Daniel lived in secrecy, documentation of battles he fought without her knowledge, preparations he made for conflicts he hoped she would never need to face. The oil wells continue their rhythm outside, patient and hypnotic, drawing wealth from beneath the desert with mechanical certainty that speaks of resources that will produce income for decades rather than years. She thinks about her small house in Albuquerque, her Medicare statements, her teacher's pension that arrives with reliable modesty each month. Numbers that made sense. A life that fit into manageable columns of income and expenses, planned around limitations that felt comfortable because they were familiar. This doesn't fit into any category she knows how to create. This represents choices she never prepared to make, responsibilities that require knowledge she doesn't possess, conflicts that extend far beyond her experience of family disagreements resolved over holiday dinners and birthday phone calls. But as she scrolls through Daniel's careful documentation of his brother's business practices, one truth emerges with crystalline clarity: he wasn't hiding this inheritance to hurt her. He was preparing it to protect her from the very men who appeared at her door today, with demands disguised as family concern, entitlement masked as helpful guidance. The question that haunts her as she finally closes the laptop isn't whether Daniel was justified in keeping secrets. The question is whether she possesses enough courage to honor the choice he died trying to give her the freedom to become someone larger than the careful, modest woman who has spent 62 years assuming that other people would handle the complicated decisions while she managed the details of daily survival. Outside, desert wind builds strength as it often does after sunset, rattling windows and whistling through eaves with sounds that speak of vastness and possibility. And the kind of solitude that either breaks people or reveals strength they never knew they possessed. Coyotes call to each other across the mesa with voices that sound like laughter or grief, depending on the listener's state of mind. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, Margaret Hayes falls asleep not in her familiar bed surrounded by familiar sounds and familiar limitations, but in a chair in a house she owns in a place she's never seen, holding a key that opens not just gates but entire possibilities she's only beginning to understand. The certified letter arrives with the grudging efficiency of rural mail delivery, brought by a weathered pickup truck that serves double duty as the postal service for ranch country, where distances between mailboxes can measure in miles rather than yards. Maggie signs for the envelope on the porch steps of the ranch house, her breath visible in the sharp morning air that carries hints of snow from the higher elevations, her hands stiff from cold and the restless night spent reading through Daniel's files until her eyes burned with exhaustion and revelation. Inside the kitchen, she spreads the courthouse correspondence. Beside the growing collection of documents that have come to define her new reality, Medicare explanations that once seemed complicated, but now feel simple compared to mineral rights agreements, Daniel's ranch deed with its heavy paper and raised seals, bank statements showing accounts she never knew existed. The morning light streaming through the window illuminates this paper landscape of legal complexity with harsh clarity that makes every letterhead and official seal stand out like evidence in a courtroom. The petition from Daniel's brothers reads like a carefully constructed attack disguised as family concern. Legal phrases wrap around accusations that sting with professional precision, competency issues arising from medication interactions, spousal incapacity regarding complex financial decisions, and immediate freeze of all mineral extraction activities pending resolution of estate questions. Each paragraph builds toward the same conclusion: Margaret Hayes cannot be trusted to manage resources this valuable. They're calling him incompetent, she whispers to the empty kitchen, where the refrigerator hums its mechanical response and the coffee maker gurgles through its morning cycle with sounds that have become her primary companions in this isolated place. Or maybe they're saying I'm the incompetent one. She reads the petition 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of insult wrapped in legal language, designed to sound protective while systematically dismantling her right to make her own decisions. The brothers claim Daniel was suffering from medication-induced confusion and impaired judgment when he purchased Coyote Mesa Ranch. They've submitted medical records as supporting evidence. They want the court to appoint an independent conservator to manage all mineral rights until questions of spousal capacity and family financial obligations can be properly resolved. The phrase spousal capacity burns like acid on her tongue, as if being widowed has somehow lobotomized her, transformed 40 years of managing household finances and raising a daughter into evidence of incompetence rather than experience, as if the death of her husband has reduced her to someone who requires supervision, rather than someone who has survived the most devastating loss imaginable and continues to function, learn, adapt. 2 hours later, she drives south toward the Mora County Courthouse, through landscape that looks different under the weight of legal documents and family betrayal. The high desert that seemed peaceful yesterday now feels exposed, vulnerable, too open for comfort. Every mesa formation might conceal mineral deposits worth fighting over. Every stretch of seemingly empty land might represent resources that transform neighbors into enemies and family members into predators. The courthouse squats like a bureaucratic fortress in the center of a town that time seems to have forgotten its squat. Brick construction and flat roof, speaking of governmental efficiency, prioritized over architectural inspiration. The building sits between a feed store advertising winter hay and a diner whose neon sign promises home cooking in letters that flicker with electrical uncertainty. This is the kind of small-town courthouse where real people bring real problems, where justice moves at the pace of rural life rather than urban urgency. Inside, the atmosphere carries decades of accumulated human drama. Floor cleaner that can't quite mask the scent of fear and hope, fluorescent lights that buzz with the particular frequency of institutional lighting. Wooden benches worn smooth by countless families waiting for legal resolution to problems that resist simple solutions. A deputy sits behind a metal desk that has seen better decades, his uniform crisp despite the worn chair that creaks under his weight. Families cluster throughout the waiting area, their conversations hushed but intense, each group wrapped in their own legal crisis. Maggie clutches her leather purse like armor, feeling inside its familiar confines the weight of her Medicare card, her Social Security statement. The ranch key that has become a talisman of choices she never expected to make. The key has grown warm from her nervous handling, its metal surface smooth from years of use by hands she never met. But whose purposes she's only beginning to understand. The small courtroom fills with the particular tension that precedes legal confrontation. That electric anticipation that occurs when personal conflicts become public theater. Daniel's brothers occupy one table with legal representation that screams urban sophistication and rural intimidation, a lawyer whose tailored suit probably cost more than Maggie's monthly pension. Whose boots shine with the particular gleam of expensive leather. Whose briefcase bears the subtle logos that suggest client lists extending far beyond local ranchers and small-town disputes. At the defendant's table, she finds herself alone in a metal chair that conducts cold directly into her bones, the isolation deliberate and symbolic. Around her, the courtroom fills with the whispered conversations of observers drawn by curiosity or personal involvement in similar disputes, their voices creating a background hum of speculation and judgment that makes her feel like a specimen under examination. When the judge mispronounces her name, transforming Margaret Hayes into something that sounds foreign and diminished. Earl's chuckle carries just far enough to reach the gallery. The sound crawls under her skin like an insult designed to establish hierarchy before formal proceedings even begin. Announcing to everyone present that this little old lady has gotten herself involved in matters beyond her comprehension. No offense intended, Your Honor, Earl says as he rises with practiced smoothness. His voice carrying the particular blend of deference and authority that suggests extensive courtroom experience, but my younger brother wasn't thinking clearly when he made this land purchase. He was on multiple heart medications, confused about money, making decisions that didn't align with his lifelong pattern of careful financial management. Their attorney activates presentation equipment with remote control precision, causing a projection screen to descend from the ceiling like a theatrical curtain revealing the main act. Maggie's Medicare explanation of benefits appears magnified for public consumption. The Santa Rosa cardiology appointment circled in red marker that transforms private medical information into public evidence of alleged incompetence. You'll note, Your Honor, the lawyer continues with the smooth delivery of someone who has perfected this performance through repetition. This appointment was paid for from a secondary account that Mrs. Hayes claims no knowledge of. We see here a clear pattern of secretive financial behavior combined with documented medical evidence of declining cognitive function. A murmur ripples through the gallery like wind through wheat, carrying undertones of sympathy mixed with the particular fascination that accompanies public revelation of private failures. Maggie feels heat crawl up her neck as dozens of eyes turn toward her, strangers. Examining her marriage and finding it wanting, her competence and discovering it questionable. He wasn't confused, she says, her voice emerging thinner than intended, barely carrying to the judge's bench despite the courtroom's acoustic design. He was private about certain things. There's a difference between privacy and confusion. The judge peers over reading glasses that have seen decades of small-town legal drama, his expression suggesting professional patience worn thin by too many family disputes that could have been resolved around kitchen tables rather than in courtrooms that charge taxpayers for every minute of proceedings. Mrs. Hayes, do you have legal representation for these proceedings? The question hangs in the courtroom air like smoke, visible and toxic and impossible to ignore. Around the room, people shift in their seats with the uncomfortable recognition that they are witnessing someone navigate legal complexity without professional guidance. Like watching someone perform surgery on themselves while observers debate whether to intervene or simply document the disaster. My husband died 6 weeks ago, she says, gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles show white against tanned skin, marked with the age spots that accumulate like proof of survival. I have a mortgage payment due next week, arthritis that makes it difficult to open pill bottles, and a teacher's pension that covers basic expenses if I'm careful about everything. I borrowed money from my church emergency fund to put gas in my car to drive here today. Earl's attorney seizes the admission like a predator recognizing wounded prey. his professional smile widening with satisfaction that doesn't quite reach his eyes but radiates from his posture and the way he leans forward as though moving in for a decisive strike. Exactly our primary concern, Your Honor. Mrs. Hayes is clearly overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her experience and vulnerable to exploitation by parties who might take advantage of her emotional state and lack of business sophistication. We're simply asking this court to appoint an independent conservator to oversee these valuable mineral rights until the family situation stabilizes. It's purely protective intervention designed to serve her best interests. Earl leans toward her table with movement calculated to appear spontaneous, while ensuring his whispered words carry exactly far enough to reach their intended audience. His aftershave mingles with the scent of legal documents and courthouse disinfectant, creating an olfactory map of intimidation disguised as family concern. We'll make sure you receive a generous monthly stipend, Maggie. You don't want to be buried in paperwork and corporate negotiations at your age. Let us handle the complicated business decisions so you can focus on grieving and adjusting to your new circumstances. The words strike her like physical blows, each phrase designed to reduce her from autonomous adult to dependent child requiring supervision and protection from her own allegedly impaired judgment. At your age, echoes in her mind with particular poison, suggesting that reaching 62 has somehow disqualified her from making decisions about her own future, her own property, her own life. The fluorescent lights buzz with increased intensity that makes her temple throb. Someone in the gallery coughs with deliberate significance. The deputy by the door shifts his weight, causing his utility belt to creak with sounds that punctuate the silence like small exclamation points marking each humiliating moment. Maggie stares down at her hands, at the wedding ring she continues to wear. Despite Daniel's absence, at the small callus on her index finger that developed over 40 years of grading papers and balancing checkbooks and teaching hundreds of teenagers to think critically about literature and life. These hands have managed every aspect of a household, raised a daughter who grew into a successful professional, navigated bureaucracies and medical systems and financial institutions with competence that never required supervision or validation from anyone. She grips her purse tighter, feeling through the leather. The outline of the ranch key and the folded corner of Daniel's letter with its message of confidence in her strength and intelligence. In her mind, his voice emerges clearly from the video she watched until dawn. You don't owe them explanations, access, or this land. No, she says, her voice gaining volume and clarity with each word. If someone is going to speak for Daniel and me, if someone is going to make decisions about our property and our future, it will be someone I choose, not someone chosen by people who want to profit from my alleged incompetence. The lawyer's confident smile falters slightly, revealing uncertainty beneath professional polish. Earl's jaw tightens with barely controlled anger. The gallery murmur shifts tone from sympathetic to intrigued, sensing that this might develop into actual conflict rather than simple bureaucratic processing of a predetermined outcome. The judge makes careful notes on papers that will become part of permanent legal record, his pen scratching across official forms with sounds that seem unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet courtroom. After what feels like geological time, he looks up with an expression that suggests his patience for family drama has definite limits. Mrs. Hayes, he says with deliberate care, I'm going to continue this hearing for 30 days to provide you adequate time to obtain legal representation. I strongly recommend you take advantage of this opportunity to consult with qualified counsel before we reconvene for final disposition of these matters. As people begin filing toward the exits with the shuffling efficiency of courthouse veterans, Earl and Wayne's attorney approaches her table with sympathy that feels more threatening than their earlier aggression. His expression suggests concerned professionalism while his words carry undertones of ultimatum disguised as helpful guidance. Mrs. Hayes, please consider our offer seriously during this recess period. Sign the conservatorship papers we've prepared, and you won't have to worry about any of this legal complexity. You can focus entirely on processing your grief, without the additional stress of corporate negotiations and mineral rights management that honestly require specialized expertise. She looks up at this man whose expensive education and professional credentials are being used to justify stealing her inheritance through legal manipulation disguised as protective intervention. Behind him, Earl adjusts his belt buckle with satisfaction while Wayne checks his phone with the casual indifference of someone whose victory seems assured. Both brothers look through her rather than at her, as though she has already been reduced to a signature on documents they've prepared in advance. "I'll consider everything carefully," she says quietly, though both she and the attorney understand the lie contained in those words. Walking through the courthouse doors into sharp winter sunlight feels like emerging from a cave into a world that has changed during her underground ordeal. Cars pass on the main street with normal afternoon purpose, their occupants unaware that the elderly woman standing on courthouse steps has just been publicly declared incompetent to manage her own affairs by family members who measure her value in terms of mineral extraction and corporate negotiations. Earl's SUV pulls out of the courthouse parking lot with deliberate slowness, its windows dark enough to conceal expressions but not attitudes. The lawyer's BMW follows with urban efficiency that contrasts sharply with rural surroundings. Both vehicles disappearing around a corner like predators returning to hunting grounds after unsuccessful first attempts. As their taillights fade, Maggie realizes something that simultaneously frightens and emboldens her: this courtroom. Humiliation represents just the opening move in a campaign designed to separate her from Daniel's inheritance through legal manipulation backed by family pressure and public shame. They expect her to surrender rather than fight, to choose security over autonomy, to accept their management, rather than risk their continued attacks on her competence and dignity. She gets into her car and drives toward Coyote Mesa Ranch through desert afternoon light that seems brighter and cleaner than anything she experienced during her courthouse ordeal. The ranch key sits warm in her palm, no longer feeling like burden or accusation but like possibility waiting for someone brave enough to explore it fully. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, Margaret Hayes stops planning merely how to survive each day and begins strategizing how to win a war. She finally understands she's been drafted to fight. Back at Coyote Mesa Ranch, wind has transformed from gentle desert breeze into something with teeth, driving sand against the windows with persistence that sounds like fingernails clawing against glass in desperate rhythm. The storm that weather forecasters predicted as light winds has become a sustained assault that makes the substantial house feel fragile, isolated, vulnerable to forces larger than human intention or architectural confidence. Maggie sits at the kitchen island surrounded by documents that represent two entirely different versions of her life, spread across the granite surface like competing maps to incompatible destinations. Property tax notices for Coyote Mesa Ranch demand payments that exceed her monthly pension, while her familiar Albuquerque mortgage statement represents the manageable financial reality she understood until 6 weeks ago. The numbers swim before her eyes, refusing to balance into anything resembling sustainable solution. 2 roofs, 2 tax obligations, 2 sets of utility bills, she murmurs to the empty house, her voice nearly lost in the sound of wind trying to find weakness in walls and windows. One widow's social security check that was never designed to cover any of this complexity. The refrigerator responds with mechanical sympathy, its compressor cycling on with steady determination that contrasts sharply with her own emotional chaos. Somewhere within the walls, the house settles with small sounds that remind her of its substantial construction, while simultaneously emphasizing how alone she is in this remote place. How far from neighbors or immediate help should the legal harassment escalate beyond courtroom humiliation into more direct intimidation? She opens Daniel's laptop with fingers that have grown familiar with its weight and warmth, clicking on the "For Maggie" folder that has become her primary source of guidance and her deepest source of pain. The video files stretch back 3 years, each thumbnail showing Daniel's face at different stages of his secret planning, documenting a parallel life he lived without her knowledge while she remained focused on Medicare appointments and grocery budgets and the small, domestic details that seemed important when she believed their marriage contained no fundamental deceptions. The first video loads to show Daniel younger and healthier than in his final months, sitting on this very porch, with desert light making him squint slightly as he looks directly into camera lens with expression she never saw during their marriage. Not the gentle resignation of his final illness, not the careful optimism he maintained for her benefit during medical appointments, but something approaching fear mixed with determination she didn't know he possessed. "Hey, Mags," he says, his voice carrying warmth she recognizes mixed with tension she never detected. "If you're watching this, it means I chickened out of telling you everything while I still had time to answer your questions and help you prepare for what's coming." Tears blur her vision as his confession unfolds in carefully chosen words that reveal not just his actions but his reasoning. Not just his decisions but his terror that involving her would destroy their peaceful life together or, worse, put her in danger from family members whose greed had already cost their parents dignity and financial security. "I knew my brothers would come for this land. The minute they smelled money under the mesa," he continues, wind chimes barely audible behind his voice on the recording. "I just couldn't figure out how to tell you I'd bought us into a family war without making you regret every quiet evening we ever spent together." She pauses the video to wipe her face with kitchen towel that smells faintly of the fabric softener she's used for 20 years. A domestic anchor to familiar routines in the midst of revelations that continue reshaping her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her security, her future. As sunset paints the western sky in shades of copper and rose, the house grows dimmer around her. Despite motion-activated lighting that responds to her movements through rooms Daniel furnished with care she never suspected. She wraps herself in his flannel shirt, the fabric still holding traces of his scent mixed with cigarette smoke from the habit he thought he'd hidden successfully, and clicks play on another video. In this recording, he sits at the desk in his hidden office beneath the equipment shed, pointing to an enormous map of Coyote Mesa that fills the wall behind him. Red circles mark various sections of the property, each annotated with numbers and codes that mean nothing to her, but clearly held significance for his planning. "They'll tell you the money is all in the eastern section where those visible oil wells operate," he says, tapping areas marked with yellow highlights. "They're wrong, Mags. The real treasure sits under the western ridge, the part that looks like worthless rock and scrub brush. The geologist calls it tight gas formations and unconventional uranium deposits. I call it our insurance policy against people who think being family gives them rights to other people's property." "Then why didn't you just tell me about any of this?" she asks the empty kitchen, her voice cracking with frustration that encompasses not just his secrecy, but her own willful ignorance of signs she might have recognized if she'd been paying attention to anything beyond their comfortable domestic routine. Her phone rings with jarring suddenness that makes her jump hard enough to nearly knock over her coffee mug. The caller ID shows Lena's name and Denver area code, calling from a life 6 hours north, where she manages marketing campaigns and parent-teacher conferences and soccer carpools with the same organizational efficiency she inherited from the mother she's about to inadvertently betray. "Mom, Uncle Earl called me this afternoon," Lena says without preliminary greetings, her voice carrying strain that suggests difficult conversations and conflicted loyalties. "He says you're being stubborn about Dad's ranch situation and refusing reasonable family assistance. He mentioned that he and Uncle Wayne have arranged some kind of trust fund that would guarantee you monthly income without forcing you to deal with mining companies and corporate lawyers." The words hit Maggie like ice water, each phrase revealing how thoroughly Earl has managed to reframe courtroom humiliation as concerned family intervention. Of course he contacted Lena directly. Of course he positioned himself as the reasonable adult trying to protect an unreasonable elderly woman from her own poor judgment. "And what do you think about their generous offer?" she asks, working to keep sarcasm from creeping into her voice while knowing that her daughter's response will determine whether she faces this battle with family support or complete isolation. A pause stretches across the connection, filled with background sounds of Lena's ordinary life, her son practicing violin with more enthusiasm than skill, her daughter asking questions about homework that requires parental navigation of Common Core mathematics that bears little resemblance to the arithmetic both women learned decades ago. "I think you're exhausted, Mom," Lena says with gentleness that feels more devastating than Earl's courtroom aggression. "Dad died 2 months ago, you're managing 2 properties now, and I'm 6 hours away with a full-time job and kids who need daily supervision. Maybe letting them handle the complicated business stuff isn't the worst solution. I don't want you taken advantage of by some mining corporation that sees a widow as easy target." The concern in her daughter's voice cuts deeper than Earl's manipulations because it comes from love. rather than greed, genuine fear rather than calculated intimidation. Maggie stares at Daniel's frozen image on laptop screen, his worried face captured mid-explanation of geological surveys and legal strategies he developed to protect land and family from exploitation. By people who share his blood but none of his scruples about fair dealing. Lena, she says carefully, if I sign away control of this inheritance because managing it inconveniences you, I'll spend whatever time I have left unable to recognize myself in any mirror. Another pause, this one filled with what might be recognition that her mother has just drawn a line that can't be uncrossed. Established boundaries that transform their relationship from protective parent and grateful child into something more complex and potentially painful. I didn't mean it like that, Mom. I'm just worried about you being overwhelmed by things you've never dealt with before. I understand your concern, but being overwhelmed is different from being incompetent, and being inexperienced is different from being incapable of learning. After they disconnect, Maggie wanders through the darkened house with her hands sliding along cool plaster walls that Daniel chose and painted without consulting her, through rooms he furnished with money she didn't know existed, past windows that look out on landscape worth more than she ever imagined. She ends up in the small bedroom where he'd hidden a metal lockbox beneath the bed, secured with the same key that opens the ranch gates. Inside the box, she discovers evidence of planning that extends far beyond simple property ownership. Into something approaching military intelligence. Stacks of mineral lease offers dating back 5 years. Geological reports bearing official government seals, and a composition notebook filled with Daniel's meticulous documentation of his brother's business practices spanning decades. For every page documenting the land's potential value, 3 pages detail Earl and Wayne's systematic exploitation of elderly neighbors. Names, dates, bank account numbers, witness statements from people who realized too late they'd sold mineral rights for a fraction of true value. Pressure tactics involving manufactured emergencies. Contracts designed to confuse rather than inform. Legal language that buried crucial information in subclauses and appendices that required specialized knowledge to interpret correctly. You weren't planning retirement, she whispers to Daniel's careful handwriting that fills page after page with evidence of crimes disguised as business transactions. You were building a prosecution case. Sitting on the bedroom floor with her back against the bed frame, she reads until her eyes burn from strain and her arthritis makes holding pages painful. Outside, the wind builds to sustained howl that rattles windows and doors with sounds that speak of winter approaching and isolation deepening. Coyotes call to each other across the mesa with voices that rise and fall like grief. Made audible, wild and lonesome and free in ways that suddenly seem enviable rather than frightening. For one terrible moment, rock bottom feels like physical location rather than emotional metaphor. A widow alone on the floor of a house she doesn't understand, surrounded by secrets. She never asked to inherit, facing a legal battle she lacks experience to fight against family members who possess resources and ruthlessness she's only beginning to comprehend. But as she reaches the final entries in Daniel's notebook, something shifts in her understanding. His last writing, dated just 2 weeks before his death, reads like letter addressed directly to her. If Maggie finds this notebook, I hope she understands I wasn't protecting her from the truth about Earl and Wayne. I was protecting the truth until she was strong enough to use it as weapon rather than burden. She's survived 40 years of teaching. Teenagers, raised Lena to think independently, managed our household finances through every economic crisis since we married. If Earl and Wayne think a woman who accomplished all that can't handle a couple of small-time crooks with delusions of sophistication, they're about to receive education in what teachers learn about dealing with bullies who mistake kindness for weakness. The words blur as tears fill her eyes, but these aren't tears of grief or defeat. These are tears of recognition, of husband who understood her capabilities better than she understood them herself, who left her not just property and mineral rights, but permission to become everything she'd never allowed herself to be during decades of careful domestic modesty. She closes the notebook and stands with knees that protest but spirits that have found solid ground beneath the chaos. Tomorrow, she'll call attorney Ruiz and demand introduction to lawyers who specialize in energy rights and fraud cases. Tomorrow, she'll begin fighting back with weapons Daniel spent years preparing and intelligence he died gathering. Tonight, for the first time since his funeral, Margaret Hayes stops feeling like victim of circumstances beyond her control. And starts feeling like woman with battlefield advantage over enemies who have seriously underestimated their opposition. The wind continues its assault on the house, but the sound no longer feels threatening. It sounds like the desert clearing space for what's about to happen next. Morning light spills through the kitchen window with weakness that speaks of winter approaching, transforming dust motes into tiny messengers of isolation. Floating above surfaces that Daniel chose and she maintains, Maggie nurses coffee from a ceramic mug emblazoned with "World's Greatest Teacher," gift from students who graduated 15 years ago. But somehow understood something about her identity that she's only now beginning to reclaim. The refrigerator holds a photograph secured with a magnet shaped like New Mexico herself and Daniel at their first apartment in El Paso. Grinning with the particular joy of people who own nothing valuable but believe the future belongs to them. They look impossibly young, impossibly confident, standing in front of a living room. Furnished with milk crates and optimism and the assumption that honesty between spouses represents foundation rather than luxury. She studies Daniel's face in that old photograph, searching for hints of the man who would spend 3 years planning secret wars while she graded papers and planned grocery budgets. Even then, even when they possessed nothing worth protecting, he carried himself like someone guarding precious cargo. She'd found his protective instincts endearing the way he checked locks twice, kept important documents in folders marked private, insisted on handling all communication with insurance companies and mortgage brokers. Now she wonders what else he was already concealing behind protective impulses that felt like consideration rather than exclusion. The laptop contains dozens of videos spanning 3 years of secret planning. And she's developed the discipline to watch them chronologically, trying to understand when privacy became deception and why. In recordings from the earliest period, he sits in their Albuquerque backyard, with wind chimes providing musical background while afternoon light filters through chain link fence and rose bushes that belonged to the modest life they shared openly. "Remember when I promised you we'd own a piece of open sky someday?" he says. To camera, voice-carrying accent that marked him as New Mexico native despite decades of attempting standard American pronunciation. "I should have told you the sky I picked came with land my father nearly lost to whiskey and my brother's schemes to separate him from anything valuable." His smile falters as he continues, revealing cracks in confidence that she never witnessed during their marriage. "I was terrified you'd say no if you understood how much family drama came attached to this opportunity. Hell, I was terrified you'd be right to say no, that getting involved with Earl and Wayne would destroy the peaceful life we built together." "You were absolutely right to be terrified," she tells the screen, her voice mixing affection with frustration that encompasses decades of decisions made without her input. "I would have fought you on this purchase, demanded full explanation of every risk and complication. And maybe that fight would have been exactly what we needed." She drags the metal box of documents to the office and creates organizational system across the desk surface. Geological surveys here, financial records there, legal correspondence arranged chronologically to reveal patterns that Daniel documented with meticulous care. Among familiar papers, she discovers evidence she'd overlooked during previous examinations: a coffee-stained Social Security statement addressed to Daniel's father, with notation in Earl's handwriting scrawled across the margin. Dad signed power of attorney for temporary assistance, W handling checks now. Another document, folded small enough to hide in wallet pockets, contains copy of reverse mortgage application for their mother's house in Texas. The elderly woman had signed away her home's equity in exchange for monthly payments calculated to exhaust the property's value within 3 years, leaving her with rental payments she couldn't afford and children who considered her financial desperation unfortunate but profitable. The pattern emerges like photograph developing in chemical solution. Earl and Wayne haven't targeted just Coyote Mesa Ranch are recent neighbors with valuable mineral rights. They've spent decades circling elderly family members and vulnerable community members, using paperwork, complexity and family pressure to separate people from assets through legal manipulation more effective than outright theft. Memory surfaces unbidden: their wedding reception 41 years ago. When Earl cornered her beside cake table while bourbon sweetened his breath and lowered his usual careful guard. "Daniel's always been the dreamer in our family," he'd said, leaning close enough that she could see broken blood vessels across his nose and cheeks. "Thank God he found himself a practical girl who understands money management. We worried he'd marry some romantic who'd encourage his expensive ideas." At the time, she'd laughed and returned to serving cake to guests, pleased that Daniel's family appreciated her financial common sense and domestic efficiency. Now she recognizes the comment as intelligence gathering, testing whether she paid attention to household finances or preferred leaving complicated money decisions to husbands and male relatives. Another memory: Thanksgiving dinner when all the brothers gathered at their parents' modest house. Back when the older couple still maintained independence and dignity. She'd walked into the living room carrying stack of holiday bills that needed stamps and return addresses, and conversation had stopped mid-sentence. Earl smiled his practiced politician's smile while Wayne studied his boots with sudden fascination. "We'll handle the family business talk, Maggie," Earl had said with tone that mixed dismissal with paternal condescension. "No need to trouble yourself with boring financial discussions when there's sweet tea that needs refilling and dishes that need attention." She'd returned to kitchen duties, grateful for exemption from boring financial discussions that seemed to create tension whenever men gathered around dining room tables with papers and serious expressions. Now she understands they weren't protecting her from tedium, they were coordinating strategies she was never supposed to discover, making plans that required her ignorance to succeed. Heat crawls up her neck as full scope of her willful blindness becomes clear. How many warning signals had she rationalized away? How many uncomfortable moments had she explained as simple family awkwardness, rather than recognizing them as evidence of systematic manipulation that included her own marginalization from decisions affecting her future? The laptop fan whirs softly in rhythm with distant pumpjack operations that continue extracting oil from deposits. Earl and Wayne assumed they would control by now. Outside, wind carries scents of petroleum and sage and possibility mixed with threat. While afternoon light slants through office windows with clarity that makes every detail sharp enough to cut. "No more," she says to the empty room with voice that surprises her with its steadiness. "If they want to play financial warfare games with paperwork and legal intimidation, they're about to discover what teachers learn about dealing with bullies who mistake courtesy for cowardice." She clicks on another video file, this one recorded in their Albuquerque living room during what appears to be early stages of his illness. When treatment still promised recovery rather than simply managing decline. Daniel holds manila folder toward camera like evidence in courtroom proceeding, his face carrying expression of resolve mixed with regret that she recognizes from their marriage but never understood until now. "I was a coward, Mags," he says with directness that cuts through screen technology to reach her in present moment. "I couldn't face my brother's reaction to me protecting our interests. And I couldn't bring myself to drag you into mess they'd created with their schemes and threats. So I tried to set up the chessboard to give you winning position without forcing you to play game while I was still alive to face consequences." He raises the folder higher, shaking it slightly for emphasis. "If you find the notebook and geological reports, if you discover bank records and witness statements, you'll have everything needed to prove pattern of elder abuse that extends far beyond our situation. You'll have weapons they don't know exist and evidence they've forgotten they left behind." A sound escapes her throat, part laughter and part sob, as she recognizes classic Daniel strategy: solving problems through preparation rather than confrontation. Building solutions in private rather than forcing family conflicts into public spaces where relationships might suffer permanent damage. Even dying, even facing his brother's inevitable assault on her inheritance. He'd tried to protect her from battle while ensuring she possessed tools for victory. She spreads geological reports, notebook pages, and screenshots of questionable financial transactions across office floor. Like puzzle pieces that form picture of systematic criminal activity disguised as legitimate business. Each document that once felt like evidence of her incompetence now appears as breadcrumb deliberately placed along trail leading toward justice. The Western Ridge surveys show mineral deposits worth hundreds of millions rather than the modest amounts Earl and Wayne disclosed in their court filings. The notebook documents decades of exploitation targeting elderly neighbors who trusted family friends more than corporate lawyers. Bank records reveal pattern of rushed property sales and deliberately undervalued contracts that transferred long-term wealth, while providing minimal short-term payments to sellers who died before realizing they'd been cheated. "You didn't just leave me landmine to navigate," she murmurs to Daniel's image frozen on laptop screen. "You left me complete arsenal and detailed instructions for using every weapon effectively." As afternoon light begins its daily transition toward desert sunset, she realizes something that reshapes her understanding of grief and partnership and the particular loneliness of widowhood. Daniel hadn't excluded her from this battle to spare her pain or protect her from complexity. He'd prepared for war on her behalf. While she remained unaware that conflict was approaching, building legal fortress designed to transform her from vulnerable widow into formidable opponent. The fear and sadness that have weighed on her chest since courthouse humiliation begin rearranging themselves into something sharper, more focused, more useful. Not just anger at Earl and Wayne's greed and manipulation, but determination to prove that woman who balanced 40 years of household finances while teaching teenagers critical thinking can damn well handle couple of small-town criminals who mistake family connections for immunity from consequences. For the first time since Daniel's death, Margaret Hayes stops feeling like victim of circumstances beyond her control and starts feeling like widow. With secret weapons and detailed battle plans, facing enemies who have seriously underestimated their opposition and left themselves vulnerable to counterattack they'll never see coming. Evening settles over Coyote Mesa like velvet curtain drawn across stage where tomorrow's drama will unfold, and Maggie follows hand-drawn map tucked between pages of Daniel's notebook toward equipment shed that sits at property's far edge like forgotten period at end of long sentence. Her knees protest each step over rough ground, still holding day's heat despite approaching darkness. But determination carries her forward across terrain that looks ordinary until examined closely enough to reveal its hidden potential. The shed appears unremarkable from outside, weathered wood siding that has aged to silver gray. Corrugated metal roof that bears decades of hail dents and wind scarring, the kind of agricultural outbuilding that accumulates on every working ranch through necessity rather than architectural planning. Inside, air carries layered scents of motor oil and dust and something else. She can't immediately identify the particular aroma of secrets carefully maintained over time. She follows Daniel's detailed instructions to stack of feed bags arranged with suspicious precision in far corner, moving each 50-pound sack with effort that makes her arthritis flare but also brings satisfaction of physical problem-solving. Beneath artificial randomness, she discovers trapdoor cut into concrete floor, with craftsmanship that required professional tools and considerable planning to execute without attracting attention. "Of course you built yourself underground bunker," she mutters, lifting heavy door with grunt that echoes across empty desert. "You always did love those Cold War spy novels where ordinary people discovered they possessed extraordinary capabilities when circumstances demanded heroism." Narrow staircase descends into cool darkness that feels like stepping backward through geological time toward layer of earth, where secrets crystallize into permanent formations. She locates light switch exactly where Daniel's note promised, and fluorescent bulbs illuminate concrete room that makes her catch breath with recognition of planning that extended far beyond simple property purchase into full-scale intelligence operation. The underground space exceeds her Albuquerque living room in both size and organization. Lined with filing cabinets that suggest years of document accumulation and dominated by desk-facing wall covered with maps that transform property boundaries into strategic battlefield. Giant survey map of Coyote Mesa and surrounding federal land spreads like military command center, marked with colored pins and annotations written in Daniel's careful handwriting that traces mineral deposits, water rights, access roads, and vulnerable points where corporate pressure might be applied. Opposite wall displays corkboard holding printouts of emails, corporate filings, and property records with Earls and Waynes names highlighted in yellow marker that glows under fluorescent lighting like evidence of crimes waiting for prosecution. Bank statements, legal documents, and witness affidavits create mosaic of systematic exploitation that stretches back decades, each piece contributing to larger picture of criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate family business. Filing cabinet labeled Strategic Defense contains binders organized with precision that reflects Daniel's methodical nature. Expanded beyond household management into warfare preparation. First binder holds independent geological surveys commissioned without Earl's or Wayne's knowledge, revealing mineral wealth concentrated beneath Western Ridge exactly where Daniel claimed it would be found. Technical language means little to her, but summary pages make implications clear. This land contains resources worth more than most people accumulate through lifetime of careful saving. Second binder documents questionable mineral deals Earl and Wayne negotiated with elderly neighbors, complete with before and after property valuations that reveal scale of systematic theft accomplished through legal manipulation. Each transaction follows identical pattern: manufactured emergency requiring quick decision, generous immediate payment. Obscuring long-term value transfer, contracts written to favor buyers while leaving sellers with minimal ongoing compensation. Third binder makes her hands shake with recognition of planning that extended beyond property protection into criminal prosecution. Draft letter addressed to New Mexico Attorney General outlines pattern of elder financial abuse. Supported by witness statements from neighbors who realized too late they'd been cheated, bank records showing suspicious money transfers, and documentation of pressure tactics used to manipulate vulnerable people into signing contracts they didn't understand. You weren't confused about anything, she whispers to empty bunker where fluorescent lights hum with electrical determination. You were building case that would send them to prison if they pushed this conflict beyond civil disagreement into criminal territory. She climbs back to ground level as full darkness transforms desert landscape into vast cathedral of stars and wind. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by isolation, she experiences something approaching exhilaration. These aren't just accusations based on hurt feelings or family resentment. These are documented crimes with clear victims and provable patterns that extend beyond personal dispute into systematic elder abuse affecting entire community. Back in main house, she initiates video conference with attorney Ruiz, angling laptop screen to provide clear view of most damaging evidence while maintaining careful control over what information she reveals. Under blue glow of camera light, she displays selected pages from Daniel's binders with precision that suggests military briefing rather than widow's confusion. I don't want to sell them anything, she states with authority that surprises both herself and lawyer, whose eyebrows rise as he processes implications of documentation she's revealing. But I am willing to discuss terms with parties who treat me like competent adult, rather than confused signature waiting to be manipulated onto prepared documents. Ruiz's professional composure cracks slightly as he examines geological surveys and financial records through camera connection. His legal training recognizing evidence that could support both civil and criminal proceedings if properly developed. Mrs. Hayes, this documentation suggests potential criminal activity extending far beyond estate disputes. You need representation that specializes in energy law, fraud prosecution, and federal oversight of mineral rights on properties adjacent to government land. Within week, she's conducting video conferences with Carla Mendoza, energy attorney from Houston, whose office windows frame skyline of oil company headquarters and corporate towers built on exactly the kind of mineral wealth that Daniel secured for her inheritance. Carla's sharp eyes miss nothing as she examines evidence through high-resolution camera that reveals every detail of Daniel's careful documentation. Mrs. Hayes, energy companies would commit minor felonies for access to geological data like what your husband compiled. Carla states with matter-of-fact directness that cuts through legal euphemism to essential truth. Your biggest challenge isn't determining whether this land has value, it's ensuring you don't get cheated out of inheritance through pressure tactics designed to exploit your unfamiliarity with industry standard practices. Then let's make sure that doesn't happen, Maggie replies, surprised by steadiness in her own voice that carries confidence she didn't know she possessed. Carla arranges confidential meeting with Rio Verde Resources, competing energy company that Daniel contacted months before his death through channels that bypassed Earl's and Wayne's assumed monopoly on family mineral negotiations. Conference room in Santa Fe provides neutral territory where floor-to-ceiling windows overlook mountains. while polished table reflects geological reports and mineral surveys that Daniel accumulated through patient intelligence gathering. Rio Verde's CEO examines documentation with professional appreciation that borders on admiration. Whistling low as she processes implications of comprehensive geological analysis combined with legal ownership that Daniel secured despite family opposition. Your husband understood exactly what he controlled, she says, looking directly at Maggie with respect rather than condescension. This isn't just valuable property, this represents generational wealth that could produce income for decades, if managed properly rather than liquidated quickly. Together, they develop strategy that makes Maggie's pulse quicken with recognition of power she never imagined possessing. Instead of selling mineral rights outright to highest bidder, she'll offer carefully structured leases with strict environmental safeguards. Royalties paid into trust fund that ensures long-term financial security, and contractual clauses that allow her to terminate operations if regulations are violated or community interests compromised. I want this land to outlive me, she tells assembled executives with authority that carries 40 years of teaching experience applied to new subject matter. Not just provide quick profit, but contribute to sustainable development that benefits community rather than exploiting it for external corporate interests. Carla nods approvingly while Rio Verde representatives exchange glances that suggest they've rarely encountered mineral rights owners who prioritize long-term community benefit over immediate personal wealth. That approach requires more complex legal structure than simple sale agreement, but it also provides significantly better protection against market volatility and regulatory changes that could affect future income. That evening, she initiates video call with Lena, but this time her voice carries none of uncertainty that marked their earlier conversations. She plays carefully selected excerpts from Daniel's recordings where he speaks directly to their daughter, apologizing for maintaining secrecy while explaining in careful detail how his brothers systematically exploited elderly family members, including their own parents. Silence on Lena's end stretches long enough to suggest her daughter is processing fundamental revision of family history and personal loyalties that seemed stable until evidence contradicted assumptions. When she finally speaks, her voice carries shock mixed with anger that encompasses both her father's deception and her own gullibility in accepting Earl's version of events. They made it sound like Dad was suffering from medication-induced dementia, Lena whispers with tone that suggests she's reviewing every conversation, every assurance, every explanation that seemed reasonable until viewed through lens of systematic manipulation. I believed them over my own mother. I actually considered that their concerns about your competence might be legitimate. So did I, Maggie admits with honesty that encompasses not just recent doubts, but decades of accepting exclusion from complicated financial decisions as protection rather than marginalization. But we both understand better now. I need you fighting beside me for this, not watching from sidelines while hoping everything resolves itself without requiring your personal involvement. By call's conclusion, Lena has committed to flying down for next court hearing. Not as neutral observer hoping for quick resolution but as active ally prepared to confront family members whose manipulation extended to using her own concerns about her mother's welfare as weapon against her mother's interests. As Maggie closes laptop after series of calls that have transformed her from isolated widow into woman, with legal team, strategic allies, and detailed battle plan, pump jacks outside continue steady rhythm that no longer sounds like countdown toward disaster. Instead, mechanical percussion marks tempo of resources being extracted under her ownership, generating revenue that will fund legal fees, expert testimony, and whatever other weapons prove necessary for victory in conflict. She finally understands how to fight. For first time since Daniel's funeral, Margaret Hayes falls asleep not to sound of worry preventing rest, but to quiet satisfaction of woman who has discovered weapons and learned how to use them with precision that would make her late husband proud and her enemies very, very nervous. Dawn breaks over Mora County with crystalline clarity that makes every detail of approaching conflict sharp enough to cut, and Maggie wakes in ranch house bedroom where Daniel's absence feels less like wound and more like presence of different kind, his strategic planning transformed into her tactical advantage. His secret preparations becoming her open warfare against family members who mistake grief for weakness. She dresses with deliberate care in navy blazer borrowed from church friend, who understood without explanation that some battles require armor as well as ammunition, her silver hair pinned in style that suggests professional competence rather than domestic fragility. The drive toward courthouse feels fundamentally different from her previous legal humiliation, less like journey toward execution and more like approach to battlefield, where she finally understands terrain and possesses superior intelligence about enemy positions. Lena waits in courthouse parking lot with laptop bag containing Daniel's videos, an expression of determination that mirrors her mother's resolve. Both women united by shared recognition that they've been manipulated by family members who measured their value in terms of compliance rather than contribution. Together, they walk through front doors past same tired deputy and squeaking benches and fluorescent lighting that witnessed earlier defeat, but this time, defense table feels like command center rather than isolation chamber. Carla Mendoza's presence transforms small courtroom into something approaching legitimate legal proceeding, rather than family intervention disguised as judicial oversight. Houston Energy attorney arranges documents with precision that speaks of extensive courtroom experience, while creating atmosphere of professional confidence that contrasts sharply with Earl's and Wayne's previous assumption of easy victory against unrepresented widow. Binders containing Daniel's evidence land on defense table with satisfying impact that echoes through courtroom like judge's gavel announcing serious business. Each volume represents months of careful documentation, witness statements, financial records, and geological surveys that Daniel accumulated while his brothers assumed his secrecy indicated confusion, rather than strategic preparation for exactly this legal confrontation. Earl and Wayne enter with their attorney, confidence intact but noticeably diminished by presence of professional opposition they hadn't anticipated facing. They've brought additional support representative from Southwestern extraction, whose expensive watch and practiced smile suggest corporate backing designed to intimidate rural judge into accepting predetermined outcome. His presence transforms family dispute into something approaching corporate colonialism, outside interests, using local conflicts to access resources through manipulation rather than fair negotiation. Your Honor, their attorney begins with slightly less smoothness than previous hearing demonstrated. We've revised our petition to focus on practical resolution that serves everyone's interests. We're requesting equitable division of mineral proceeds rather than wholesale management takeover. And we've arranged preliminary offer from Southwestern Extraction that provides Mrs. Hayes immediate financial security without requiring her to navigate complex corporate negotiations. The word equitable hangs in courtroom air like smoke from lies, while practical resolution translates as pressure tactic, designed to force quick decision that benefits everyone except woman whose property is being divided among people who contributed nothing to its acquisition or maintenance. Maggie feels familiar flutter of anxiety that characterized her previous court appearance, but this time instead of drowning in intimidation, she leans toward microphone with voice steady enough to carry clearly throughout courtroom. Your Honor, with respect, they continue leaving out most of the relevant story. At Carla's subtle signal, Lena activates tablet connected to courtroom monitor, revealing Daniel's face frozen mid-sentence in front of ranch map that hangs in his underground bunker. At judge's permission, they play carefully edited clip where Daniel explains geological surveys and mentions by name independent experts whose reports contradict everything Earl and Wayne have claimed about land's true value. Second video segment shows Daniel sitting at kitchen table in their Albuquerque home, speaking directly to camera about his brother's history of pressuring elderly family members into unfavorable deals while maintaining facade of protective concern. His voice carries clarity and organization that contradicts completely any suggestion of medication-induced confusion or declining cognitive function. These recordings document 3 years of systematic planning, Carla states as videos conclude. Not evidence of impaired judgment but proof of extensive preparation for legal defense against family members whose pattern of elder exploitation extends far beyond this specific case. She distributes copies of geological surveys, mineral evaluations, and draft letter Daniel prepared for State Attorney General, each document tabbed and highlighted with legal precision that transforms family squabble into potential criminal prosecution. Bank records, property transfer documents, and witness statements create paper trail of systematic fraud disguised as legitimate business transactions. Furthermore, Carla continues while judge examines evidence with expression, suggesting increasing skepticism about brothers' motives. We've documented pattern of deliberately misleading mineral rights owners about true value of their properties. Using family connections and manufactured emergencies to pressure elderly citizens into contracts that transfer long-term wealth while providing minimal short-term compensation. Earl shifts uncomfortably as judge flips through binders containing decade of questionable transactions. Each deal following identical pattern of targeting vulnerable owners, withholding crucial information, and using complexity as weapon more effective than outright theft. Wayne stares at his boots while their attorney discovers that confident legal strategy has become desperate. Damage control against evidence he didn't know existed. I also note here, judge says, tapping highlighted section with increasing gravity. Documentation of previous attempts to manipulate elderly parents and neighbors into signing over mineral rights through power of attorney arrangements and reverse mortgage schemes that left elderly citizens financially vulnerable. Mr. Earl Hayes, was your petition filed with full disclosure of these relevant conflicts of interest? Question hangs in quiet courtroom like accusation awaiting response. That everyone present understands will determine whether this remains civil dispute or escalates into criminal investigation. Earl's practiced composure cracks as he realizes scope of evidence against him. While Wayne appears to be calculating whether family loyalty extends to potential felony charges. Those previous transactions were completely legal, Earl mutters, but his voice lacks conviction. And his attorney's face suggests recognition that their legal strategy has just collapsed under weight of evidence they never anticipated facing. Carla doesn't pause for recovery time that might allow opposition to regroup. She calls Drive. Patricia Reyes, geologist from Rio Verde Resources, who testifies under oath about Western Ridge deposits. Representing significantly greater value than eastern sections where visible oil wells operate. Her expertise transforms technical surveys into understandable testimony about mineral wealth that Earl and Wayne deliberately concealed from preliminary assessments. To state this plainly for the court, Drive. Reyes says while looking directly at Southwestern Extraction representative who appears increasingly eager to distance his company from brothers' schemes. Any corporation making purchase offers based solely on partial geological data, while withholding information about additional deposits would be engaging in deliberate fraud rather than legitimate business negotiation. Southwestern Extraction representative clears throat with obvious discomfort. Suddenly motivated to establish corporate innocence in family dispute that has escalated beyond simple inheritance disagreement into potential criminal conspiracy. Your Honor, our preliminary assessment was based entirely on information provided by petitioners. We were completely unaware that comprehensive geological surveys existed or that Eastern Section represented only partial evaluation of total mineral assets. Judge's eyebrows rise with recognition that corporate victim is admitting to making substantial financial offers without conducting due diligence required for legitimate business transactions. So your company structured mineral rights purchase for widow based on incomplete data supplied by parties who stood to profit from that incompleteness? Question lands in courtroom silence like physical blow while someone in gallery coughs and deputy shifts weight, causing equipment to creak with sounds that punctuate each moment of legal disaster unfolding for Earl, Wayne, and their corporate ally. For final assault on brothers' credibility, Carla approaches bench with folder containing bank records, property transfers, and witness statements from neighbors who had been manipulated into selling mineral rights for fraction of true value. Each transaction documents identical pattern: elderly property owners pressured into quick decisions through manufactured crises, contracts written to obscure long-term implications. Profits flowing primarily to Earl and Wayne while sellers received minimal compensation. Your Honor, Carla states with prosecutorial precision that transforms civil hearing into preview of potential criminal trial. My client isn't requesting this court's assistance with complex business negotiation. She's asking for simple justice recognition that her late husband's will should be honored as written, and protection from family members who are using legal system as leverage to access inheritance they have no right to control. Words settle into courtroom atmosphere with finality that makes continued resistance appear futile rather than determined. Judge takes extended time examining evidence while Earl and Wayne exchange glances that suggest recognition their position has become untenable. And their attorney appears to be calculating billable hours required for damage control rather than victory. This court finds, Judge announces with deliberate weight that silences all conversation, that Daniel Hayes possessed full legal competency when he executed his will and purchased Coyote Mesa Ranch, that his mineral rights acquisition was legally sound and properly documented, and that Margaret Hayes is sole legitimate owner of said property and all associated mineral assets. He pauses to look directly at Earl and Wayne with expression suggesting his patience for family manipulation has reached absolute limit. Furthermore, the brothers' petition appears to have been filed without full disclosure of material conflicts of interest that raise questions about motives extending beyond simple estate resolution. Earl attempts protest, but Judge raises hand with authority that brooks no interruption. Any future attempts to interfere with Mrs. Hayes's property rights are to continue pattern of elder intimidation documented in these proceedings may result in referral to Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal violations of laws protecting elderly citizens from financial exploitation. As courtroom begins emptying with shuffle of people returning to normal business, Lena grips her mother's hand with pressure that leaves temporary marks but communicates permanence of alliance that has replaced earlier uncertainty. "You did it," she whispers with admiration that encompasses not just legal victory, but recognition of strength she'd underestimated in woman who raised her to think independently. "No," Maggie replies while watching Daniel's image still displayed on courtroom monitor, "we did it. All of us working together, including your father who spent years preparing weapons we needed for this exact battle." Earl and Wayne leave without speaking, their attorney trailing behind with expensive briefcase and practiced smile finally cracked beyond repair. As Southwestern Extraction representative hurries past defense table, he avoids eye contact while calculating corporate distance from family scheme that has exposed his company to potential fraud liability. Maggie remains seated while courtroom empties, not in triumph but in quiet satisfaction of woman who has discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed and faced down bullies who mistake loneliness for vulnerability. Courthouse victory represents beginning rather than conclusion. First successful defense of inheritance that will require continued vigilance to protect against future attacks from people who measure family loyalty in terms of profit margins rather than personal integrity. 6 months after courtroom victory, spring arrives on Coyote Mesa with desert wildflower display that transforms harsh landscape into impressionist painting of blue lupine, red Indian paintbrush, and yellow brittlebush, spreading toward horizons that seem to expand rather than limit possibility. From ranch house porch where morning coffee tastes different when consumed in landscape you own rather than simply occupy, Maggie watches carefully regulated drilling operation on Western Ridge, where Rio Verde's crews work under environmental monitoring that ensures extraction serves land as well as profit. Controlled industrial activity represents balance. Daniel would have appreciated modern technology applied with traditional respect for desert ecosystem that will continue supporting life long after current generation has returned to Earth. Rest of 5,000 acres stretches beyond immediate human intervention, populated by cattle that graze rotation patterns designed to strengthen rather than exhaust native grasslands, wild horses that move through ancient corridors their ancestors established before human boundaries divided territory into ownership parcels. Kitchen routine now includes documents that would have terrified her year ago, but feel manageable after months of education through necessity and preference rather than intimidation. Binder labeled, Coyote Mesa Trust, sits beside morning crossword and coffee mug that has survived another domestic transition. Its contents organized with precision that reflects hard-won understanding of mineral leases, environmental safeguards, and royalty structures that channel extraction profits into sustainable community development rather than simple personal enrichment. Trust fund, structured with Carla's guidance and Lena's input, directs revenues toward land restoration projects that repair decades of overgrazing, scholarship programs that help local students access higher education, without leaving community permanently, and medical care reserve that ensures her own aging. Won't require dependence on family members who might view her needs as burdens rather than responsibilities they're honored to share. Medicare explanation of benefits arrives monthly with familiarity that breeds confidence rather than anxiety, each statement representing healthcare she can afford and decisions she can make without consulting others about financial implications. Numbers in columns still require careful attention, but they represent choices rather than limitations, possibilities. Rather than constraints imposed by fixed income that seemed adequate until medical emergencies or family crises demanded resources she didn't possess. Twice weekly, small bus brings older residents from Las Vegas Senior Center for Desert Days, that began as Maggie's experiment in community education, and evolved into informal support network for people navigating complexities of Medicare, Social Security, and family relationships that change when money becomes involved. They gather under shade structure that Daniel planned but never built, completed using her first modest royalty payment as memorial to man, who understood that real security comes from community connection rather than isolated wealth accumulation. Conversation flows easily among women her age who recognize shared experiences, children who live far away with busy lives, medical appointments that multiply like bureaucratic organisms, financial decisions that require expertise they never anticipated needing. But discussions focus less on problems and more on solutions, strategies they've developed, resources they've discovered, strength they've found in themselves when circumstances demanded adaptation rather than surrender. I learned something important here, she tells group of women who nod with recognition born of similar discoveries. Letting other people handle your complicated business isn't kindness to them or protection for yourself. It's gift of your autonomy to people who might value it differently than you do. Lena visits more frequently now, bringing grandchildren who emerge from car like small tornadoes of energy and curiosity, racing across desert landscape to chase lizards and collect rocks they swear possess magical properties that adults have forgotten how to recognize. One afternoon, as Maggie signs routine trust documents at kitchen table, Lena observes from across room with expression that suggests she's processing changes in her mother that extend beyond legal victories into fundamental personality transformation. You sign your name differently now, she comments with accuracy that surprises both women. Maggie examines ink still wet on page, recognizing truth in daughter's observation. Her signature has expanded, gained confidence, claimed more space on official documents. As though she's finally willing to assert presence rather than apologizing for existing. Everything feels different, she responds. Including my handwriting, apparently. For first time in years, my signature actually feels like it belongs to me. Evening routine includes Daniel's videos, but viewing has transformed from desperate search for guidance into comfortable ritual of connection with husband, whose love expressed itself through preparation rather than explanation, protection rather than inclusion. Tonight's selection shows him sitting in unfinished office, discussing plans to restore native plant communities after drilling operations conclude. According to environmental agreements that prioritize land health over extraction efficiency. If you decided to keep this place, Mags, he says to camera while evening light creates halos around dust motes floating between them. I hope you transform it into something that reflects your values rather than just continuing my plans. This land should become extension of who you are, not monument to who I was or what I thought you needed. She smiles at screen while speaking to image that seems more alive than many living people she encounters. Working on exactly that, Danny. Building something that honors your gift while expressing my own understanding of what security really means. At same desk where Daniel planned secret strategies for family warfare, she has begun documenting her own story in composition notebooks that chronicle not just legal battles with Earl and Wayne, but decades of accepting other people's management of decisions she was qualified to make herself. Writing helps process transformation from woman who assumed financial complexity required male expertise into person who can read geological surveys, negotiate mineral leases, and structure trust funds that serve community interests while protecting individual autonomy. Pages fill with insights that surprise her recognition that she possessed business knowledge all along. but accepted cultural assumptions that certain decisions belonged to husbands, sons, brothers, male professionals, who presumably understood money in ways unavailable to elementary school teachers and domestic managers. Recovery of confidence feels less like learning new skills and more like remembering capabilities she'd been trained to suppress or redirect through socially acceptable channels. When letter arrives from woman in Saskatchewan claiming relationship to Hayes family and mentioning contact from Earl about medical donations for elderly relative, Maggie reads correspondence carefully on porch. While desert wind carries scents of sage and possibility mixed with distant petroleum operations. Writer describes Earl's suggestion that small, monthly contributions could help with someone's care while providing donors certain tax advantages that benefit everyone involved. Recognition comes immediately. Identical language Earl used with neighbors before pressuring them into unfavorable mineral lease agreements. Same mixture of family obligation and financial complexity designed to confuse rather than inform. Maggie responds same day with copies of Daniel's documentation and gentle, but firm suggestion that writer make independent decisions without pressure from anyone claiming authority over family financial matters. Pattern of manipulation stops here, even if Hayes' family tree contains branches extending far beyond her previous knowledge. Earl and Wayne's influence will not spread to relatives she's never met. Will not continue poisoning family relationships with greed disguised as helpful guidance. As sun sets behind Western Ridge where drilling operations continue under moonlight that transforms industrial equipment into silver sculptures against dark sky. Maggie stands at fence line marking boundary between her property and federal land that stretches toward mountains. Barely visible as darker shadows against star-filled darkness. Wind tugs at hair she's allowed to grow longer since Daniel's death. Carrying scents of earth and growing things and mechanical operations that represent wealth beyond her previous imagination. Ranch ownership, trust fund establishment, legal victory over family predators, all external changes that matter less than internal transformation from woman who apologized for occupying space into person who claims territory and defends it with competence she never knew she possessed. What defines her new life isn't money or land or mineral rights, but simple recognition that at 62, she chose growth over safety, complexity over simplicity, her own uncertain future over other people's comfortable management of her affairs. Coyote calls echo across Mesa with voices that speak of wildness preserved despite human intervention. Freedom maintained within boundaries of mutual respect between species that share landscape without dominating it. She listens until voices fade into night sounds of desert that breathes quietly around her, wind through vegetation, distant machinery. Settling sounds of house that belongs completely to her. Tomorrow will bring more paperwork, additional decisions, ongoing challenges of managing resources, and relationships that require constant attention to prevent abuse by people who mistake kindness for opportunity. But tonight, Mesa feels solid beneath her feet and future feels open rather than predetermined. Shaped by choices she makes rather than limitations others impose. Inside, she brews chamomile tea and settles at Daniel's desk with notebook and pen. Ready to document day's small victories and plan tomorrow's modest revolutions. Window reflection shows woman she's still learning to recognize, silver-haired, confident. Occupying space with authority that comes from surviving battles she never expected to fight and winning conflicts she never thought she could handle. Life breaks sometimes, shatters into pieces that seem impossible to reassemble into anything recognizable as hope, or joy, or simple daily satisfaction with existence itself. But what breaks can also become foundation for something stronger. More honest, more authentic than what existed before. Fracture, forced examination of assumptions that felt permanent until tested by circumstances beyond comfortable routine. If this story gave even small moment of recognition to someone facing similar challenges, if these words provided encouragement to person questioning their own capabilities when others suggest incompetence, then everything I experienced means something beyond personal survival. Sometimes our greatest trials become gifts we didn't know we needed, strength we didn't realize we possessed, wisdom that emerges only when comfortable illusions no longer provide adequate shelter from reality. If this resonated with your own experience of discovering hidden strength, please share your story in comments below. Your words might become encouragement someone else needs to continue fighting for autonomy. When family members or institutions suggest surrender would be easier for everyone involved. Thank you for spending this time with me, for witnessing this journey from victim to victor, for understanding that age and grief don't disqualify us from growing into people we never imagined